Cheon Yeowun arrived at the chief's office with Lee Ha-meng after passing the 6th test, which entitled him to receive special privileges. Before they entered, Ho Jin-chong and 2 other instructors tried to follow, but they were instructed to wait outside. As they stepped inside, Lee Ha-meng released his energy and sealed off all sound from escaping the room. Immediately after, Lee Ha-meng dropped to one knee and bowed deeply to Yeowun, respectfully congratulating him for enduring many trials and successfully passing the 6th examination. Yeowun was visibly startled by this sudden display of respect and expressed his confusion, unable to understand what was happening. Lee Ha-meng then explained that since Yeowun had completed all the examinations at the academy, he was now being treated with the proper respect due to a member of the Chun bloodline. He formally apologized for his previous attitude, stating that strict rules had bound his actions until now, and that uncertainty had forced him to observe Yeowun from the sidelines. He then directly questioned whether Yeowun had obtained the wisdom of the demonic lord. Yeowun chose to conceal the truth and stated that he did not know what Ha-meng was referring to. Understanding Yeowun's hesitation to trust him, Lee Ha-meng stepped forward and presented his medallion. He identified himself as the left-hand royal bodyguard of the patriarch and pledged his full support to Yeowun during the grand tournament for the minor priesthood. As proof of that vow, he formally offered Yeowun his royal bodyguard house medallion. Yeowun was visibly shaken by the sudden turn of events. Lee Ha-meng respectfully urged him to accept the medallion and addressed him as Warden Chun. Yeowun hesitated briefly before expressing his doubt, stating that he could not easily place his trust in someone who served as a trusted aide to the Lord. Lee Ha-meng inwardly observed that Yeowun had become far more cautious in his actions and had truly grown suited for his role. He then openly agreed with Yeowun's hesitation, acknowledging that he did indeed serve the patriarch as the left-hand royal bodyguard and that, by rule, he was not permitted to pledge his loyalty to anyone else. However, he stated that there was one matter that stood above all such rules. When Yeowun questioned what that higher priority was, Lee Ha-meng explained that the royal bodyguard houses only recognized true successors who had received the teachings of the demonic lord as the next patriarch. He revealed that what he was about to disclose was a secret known only to a very small number of people and asked Yeowun to keep it confidential. He then stated that the demonic lord's sword art currently passed down through each generation of patriarchs was not the true sword art of the demonic lord. Yeowun's expression darkened at this revelation, as he had not expected Ha-meng to speak so directly about that matter. Lee Ha-meng continued, explaining that the true sword art meant to be inherited by each patriarch had been lost 500 years ago. He detailed that the royal bodyguard was divided into 3 houses, the head, left hand, and right hand royal bodyguard houses, and that these 3 had served every patriarch from the cult's founder, the demonic lord himself, to the current patriarch, Yu Jung-chun. He explained that in the past, the demonic cult did not follow the current system where multiple descendants were born from the mothers of the 6 sects. Instead, the patriarch's wife became the divine maiden, a woman chosen by the holy fire of the grand battle altar, and her child became the minor priest. This structure prevented any imbalance of power among the sects. However, 500 years ago, disaster struck the cult. Lee Ha-meng revealed that the demonic cult traced its roots to a Zoroastrian church in Xinjiang, and that anyone appointed as patriarch was required to embark on a pilgrimage to the mountain of heaven in Xinjiang within 10 years of assuming the position. The patriarch at the time, Muhui Chun, began his pilgrimage in his 5th year as patriarch. During that journey, nearly everyone who accompanied him returned dead, including the right-hand royal bodyguard of that era. Yeowun reacted in shock upon hearing this, questioning how such a thing could have happened to a patriarch who had been counted among the top 5 martial artists of the lands. Lee Ha-meng grimly revealed that the one responsible was the berserk saber god. Yeowun's eyes widened in shock. Although he was not familiar with many of the powerful warriors of the Wulin, he clearly recognized that name as a cultist. Lee Ha-meng then explained that Patriarch Muhui Chun had indeed had a child with the divine maiden, but the child was a daughter. Since the demonic lord's sword art was meant to be passed down to the next generation, it effectively ceased to exist because of this. When his daughter turned 8 years old, Muhui Chun left this world without leaving behind a true successor of his bloodline. At the same time, the previous patriarch had also died due to illness, plunging the cult into its darkest period. To recover from this crisis, the first elder, the Sword Demon, assumed the role of vice patriarch. The Sword Demon, who was talented in areas beyond martial arts, swiftly restored stability within the cult. Once order was re-established, his foremost priority became the restoration of the lost sword art of the demonic lord. However, nothing was known about the original sword art, not the breathing technique, not the circulation technique, and not a single foundational method, making its restoration impossible. Because of this, the Sword Demon went to the detention center. It was the first time someone outside the Chun bloodline had entered that place. Although all previous patriarchs had entered the detention center, none had ever awakened to the demonic lord's wisdom, and the same was true for the sword demon. Using the sword marks carved into the sapphire stones, he was able to reconstruct the codified fighting forms. However, without the original breathing and energy control techniques, he could not fully perform those forms. Yeowun realized that this secret had never been discovered by anyone before. Lee Ha-meng continued that the sword demon remained within the detention center for 3 full years. Using the sword marks on the sapphire stones as a foundation, he eventually realized that he had created a new sword art for the demonic lord. All of the elders at the time agreed that it was just as distinguished as the original demonic lord's sword art. It was then decided that this reconstructed art would be passed down to the daughter of the patriarch. The sword demon later moved the sapphire stones from the detention center into the manual library, and Lee Ha-meng stated with certainty that Yeowun had already seen them. He further revealed that the haphazard sword marks carved on the backs of those stones had been made by the sword demon himself. Yeowun then questioned the reason those sword marks had been left behind on the stones, asking whether there had been a specific purpose behind it, and stating that they had completely vandalized the demonic lord's wisdom. Lee Ha-meng explained that the sword demon had already made copies of the sword marks left behind by the demonic lord, and had personally organized the codified fighting forms into a manual. As for the damage to the original stones, he stated that it had been an unavoidable step in the process. He revealed that exactly 2 years later, a divine monk of Shaolin named Ungong, one of the top 5 greatest martial artists of that era, was murdered by the berserk saber god at Mount Song in Henan. 2 years after that, the saber god appeared again in Jiangsu and killed another of the top 5 martial artists, the king of the deadly steel fists, Jong Gyum-yuk. The purgatory entrapment technique was believed to have been used, as Jong Gyum-yuk's body was only discovered 10 days later. Yeowun started to connect the meaning behind these events. Lee Ha-meng confirmed his suspicion, stating that the berserk saber god had been deliberately hunting the top 5 martial artists of the land. With 3 of the 5 killed by his hands, the berserk saber god's reputation rose to unimaginable heights. Among the original 5, only Swordmaster Myung Chung of the Wu-Tang sect and the sword demon remained. At that point, nearly everyone had already accepted the berserk saber god as the greatest martial artist in all the lands. Ha-meng explained that the sword demon was a sword prodigy, but the sword marks left on the victim's body showed that the berserk saber god possessed skills far beyond what the sword demon had ever imagined. The sword demon became convinced that he could not defeat the berserk saber god with his existing techniques. He determined that he needed far more powerful methods to stand against him, and those methods were the very sword marks carved into the sapphire stones. Fearing the loss of the sword demon as well, the elders granted him permission to train on the stone of the demonic lord. Yeowun reflected on this and understood why the ultimate counter technique had been engraved there, yet he remained puzzled as to why that ultimate counter technique consisted only of simple sword fighting forms. Ha-meng then revealed that 4 years later, the berserk saber god appeared at the demonic cult on the 10,000 Great Mountains. Yeowun concluded that the berserk saber god must have defeated the sword master of Wu-Tang first. Lee Ha-meng confirmed this and explained that the sword demon had been the saber god's final opponent. Their battle lasted 4 days, and although it was recorded as a draw, the sword demon paid a tremendous price. He lost his right arm, a treasure beyond measure for any martial artist. After that battle, the berserk saber god vanished from the Murim and never appeared again. Rumors circulated that he had exhausted all his energy and died, while others claimed he simply disappeared after securing his title as the greatest saberman in the lands. Following the incident, the entire cult underwent drastic changes. Having lost his arm and expended all of his raw energy, the sword demon stepped down from his position as vice patriarch. Manhwa Chun, the late patriarch's daughter, then ascended as patriarch at the age of 16. It was the first time the cult had ever served a woman patriarch, and the chiefs pressured her to abandon the tradition of selecting the divine maiden through the holy fire. Despite holding the title of patriarch, she held no true authority over the cult. This shift ultimately led to the creation of the current sect system. Patriarch Manhwa Chun had 5 husbands throughout her life. 2 of them were pupils of the sword demon, and they became the founders of the shadow sect and the sword sect. Her other 3 husbands, who were the first, second, and third elders, became the founders of the saber sect, poison sect, and musician sect. Finally, the sword demon established the demonic academy to cultivate future generations. Ha-meng cast a steady glance and asked if Yeowun understood why he was being told all of this. Yeowun replied that he assumed the academy had not been founded solely to teach and nurture younger generations. Lee Ha-meng affirmed that the academy existed for 2 purposes, one of which was to find a successor worthy of inheriting the teachings of the demonic lord. He explained that the sword demon himself had failed to awaken from within, and therefore could not fully perform the demonic lord's sword art. However, the sword demon had believed that one day, a descendant of the Chun bloodline would awaken to the demonic lord's wisdom and secrets. For that reason, he had preserved the detention center and the sealed demonic chamber and founded the academy at that location. He had also established strict rules to prevent powerful sects from tampering with the site. The sword demon had declared that once an individual fit to inherit the demonic lord's teachings appeared, that person was to be crowned as patriarch. 500 years passed, but that wish was never fulfilled, and the story survived only as secret lore passed down through the royal bodyguard houses, until Yeowun appeared. Lee Ha-meng revealed that while serving at the patriarch's side, he had witnessed the demonic lord's sword art countless times in battle. For that reason, he had not failed to recognize the same techniques when Yeowun performed them. He recalled that 3 years earlier, when Yeowun had used the sword force of the Sky Demon against Ho Jin Chang, he had been deeply shocked. At the time, however, he could not be certain that it truly represented the final wisdom left behind by the demonic lord, as it had only been a single codified fighting form, and there had been a possibility that the current patriarch himself had taught it. Because of that uncertainty, he had chosen to observe Yeowun for a longer period. His doubts were finally erased when he later witnessed Yeowun using the sword formation again against a criminal from the evil force, which allowed him to confirm the truth. Ha-meng once more emphasized that having seen the demonic lord's sword art so many times, there was no way he could fail to notice Yeowun performing the same techniques. With a trembling voice, he pressed Yeowun to answer whether he had truly inherited the truth of Chun Ma. Realizing that he could no longer deceive him, Yeowun gave a silent affirmation. At that moment, Lee Ha-meng's eyes reddened with emotion as a smile spread across his face. He dropped flat to the ground in deep prostration and formally acknowledged Yeowun as the true successor of the demonic lord. Yeowun asked Ha-meng about the second objective behind the founding of the academy. Ha-meng replied that it would be better for Yeowun to see it for himself. He then released the energy barrier that had sealed off the office and guided Yeowun outside. From there, he led him straight to the library. The instructor guarding the front of the library froze in shock upon seeing Lee Ha-meng and immediately bowed. Lee Ha-meng stated his intent to enter the underground vault. Upon hearing this, the instructor realized that Yeowun had passed the 6th examination and reacted in disbelief. After receiving confirmation, the instructor guided them inside. Once inside the library, they turned to the right and discovered a hidden staircase leading downward. Yeowun recalled hearing that the manual library had an underground floor, yet seeing it with his own eyes still surprised him. As they descended, a massive metal door came into view, guarded by 3 experts at the Grandmaster level. The guards respectfully welcomed Lee Ha-meng. He ordered them to open the door to the treasure room. The command made all 3 guards visibly tense, and they turned toward Yeowun in shock, realizing that they were witnessing the door being opened for the first time in their service. The leader of the guards took out a key. The metal door contained 3 keyholes, one held by the instructor in charge of records, one by the guard, and one by Lee Ha-meng. At the guard's count, all 3 inserted their keys and turned them at the same time. Immediately, the walls on both sides of the door trembled as the massive metal door split into 2 halves and slowly opened a path inside. Cold air seeped out from beyond the opened door, carrying a strange odor that reminded Yeowun of leather mixed with decay and medicinal embalmment. The scent was unsettling. Lee Ha-meng raised a flame and led the way into the corridor. After a short walk, they entered a vast 5-sided chamber. At the far end of the room stood a large table. Lee Ha-meng indicated that this was the academy's second purpose and motioned for Yeowun to approach. Yeowun carefully examined what lay on the table. He identified a severed arm and preserved human skin, and he clearly sensed the presence of embalmment medicine. He also noticed that the surfaces were covered in saber cuts. These were not ordinary slashes. Each cut emitted an unmistakable sharp energy. Yeowun closed his eyes and envisioned the figure who had unleashed the blade technique that caused such damage. Unlike sword techniques that combined slashes and thrusts, this blade art consisted purely of slashing formations, yet its structure was uniquely refined. He analyzed it silently and realized that even with his butterfly dance, he could not confidently defend against more than 2 formations. To confront such a technique directly, only the ultimate counter technique or the demonic lord's sword art could possibly withstand it. Yeowun recognized that this blade skill existed on an entirely different level. Yeowun then identified the severed arm as belonging to the sword demon. Lee Ha-meng confirmed this and further revealed that the preserved human skins belonged to the soldiers and the right-hand royal bodyguard who had served the patriarch 500 years earlier. Ha-meng then opened a box, revealing 3 manuals left behind by the Sword Demon: the Contemporary Demon Sword, 24 Demon Swords, and analysis of the Berserk Saber God's techniques. From this, Yeowun understood that the Academy had not only been established to find a true successor of the Demonic Lord, but also to discover someone capable of inheriting the Sword Demon's wisdom. Ha-meng affirmed that this was correct, and explained in greater detail that the true objective was to foster warriors capable of countering the techniques of the Berserk Saber God. He then revealed the final final words left behind by the sword demon before his death. Yeowun asked what those words were. Hameng explained that although the battle between the sword demon and the berserk saber god had been recorded as a draw, the berserk saber god had actually vanished in the middle of the battle. During the fight, the berserk saber god severed the sword demon's arm and then stopped the battle to disappear. Hameng continued that the berserk saber god had declared he would return. The sword demon waited 3 days, then waited 4 more days, but the berserk saber god never returned. That was the reason the battle came to be considered a draw. The berserk saber god did not appear again, not even during the 15 years before the sword demon's death, and 500 years had now passed since then. Hameng admitted that he did not truly believe a descendant of the berserk saber god would ever appear. Even so, he asked Yeowun to learn a way to counter the berserk saber god's saber techniques and to avenge the sword demon. He granted Yeowun unlimited time inside the underground vault and handed him the key, explaining that Yeowun could open the doors from the inside but would require the key to re-enter once he left. After giving Yeowun the key, Hameng departed, leaving him alone inside the vault. Yeowun observed that the manuals before him had been personally left behind by the sword demon and recognized the value of having access to such original works. He then instructed Nano to prepare for scanning, and Nano complied. Yeowun examined the contemporary demon sword and judged that while it surpassed the martial techniques of the Sixth Sex, it lacked the refinement of the demonic lord's sword art and its ultimate counter technique. He assessed that it would still serve as a suitable technique to pass on to his sword-wielding followers. He then reviewed the analysis of the berserk saber god's techniques and noted that it attempted to identify a weakness but had failed to reach any meaningful conclusion. When Yeowun turned to the 24 Demon Swords manual and began flipping through its pages, he was taken aback. He identified it as a newly created sword art derived from the awakenings achieved through the ultimate counter technique. He realized that this was the ultimate sword technique the sword demon had created to face the berserk saber god. Even so, upon assessing it, Yeowun concluded that had the sword demon fought to the bitter end, the battle would have ended in his defeat. The blade technique he had visualized in his mind, belonging to the berserk saber god, was so overwhelming that it rivaled the 4th codified fighting form of the demonic lord's sword art. Determined to verify this through direct observation, Yeowun activated Nano's augmented reality, and Nano immediately carried out the command. Yeowun instructed Nano to extract the saber marks from the severed arm and generate a simulation based on them, then to pit that reconstructed technique against the 4th codified fighting form of the demonic lord's sword art. Nano immediately acknowledged and activated the simulation comparing the saber technique with the demonic lord's 4th form. White lines rapidly formed into 2 human figures. One wielded a saber, the other a sword. The 2 figures clashed as their powerful techniques collided head-on. The outcome was decided in an instant. With a single movement, the 4th formation of the Sword Force of the Sky Demon successfully countered the Berserk Saber God's Blade formation, yet it was still driven back 3 full steps. Yeowun was shaken by the result. He recognized that while the demonic lord's sword art was more precise, the Berserk Saber God's technique possessed greater raw power. If the saber slashes on the severed arm truly originated from the Berserk Saber God's final form, then that form was slightly inferior to the demonic lord's sword art. However, if the berserk saber god had possessed a hidden form beyond this, then that unseen technique could have been the only one capable of countering the demonic lord's sword art. Yeowun rejected the notion of merely countering the saber technique. With Nano at his side, he knew the system could accurately replicate the full form based solely on the saber slashes carved into the sword demon's severed arm. He realized that a saber technique capable of rivaling the demonic lord's sword truly existed, and that this moment represented a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. 1 week had passed since Yeowun completed the 6th examination. 3 years and 7 months had elapsed since this cohort of cadets first entered the academy. From nearly 1,000 initial students, only 56 passed the 4th examination, 7 cleared the 5th, and just 1 succeeded in the 6th. Only 64 remained in total. It was the best record the academy had achieved in a full century. Yet the course of the grand tournament for the minor priesthood unfolded unlike any before it. In the past, candidates who passed the 5th examination would build their own followings and compete for dominance. This time, however, the most prominent contender, Chun of the Saber Sect, was eliminated early. Not long after, Chun of the Sword Sect lost his arm and was forced to withdraw from the academy altogether. In the end, 5 of the 6 original candidates failed to complete their time at the academy. Only 2 remained, Cheon Yeowun and Cheon Yeowun. With 5 months left, the final struggle between the two for the minor priesthood had begun. In the northwest region of the academy, a large number of cadets gathered in a wide open area. They were members aligned with with Muyeon's faction. However, Muyeon himself was not present. Among those with the greatest influence in his absence were Jin Yun-mu of the Shadow Sect and Shin-guk of a top-ranking clan. Some of the gathered cadets grew uneasy over the situation. They noted that Muyeon had neither appeared nor issued direct instructions and questioned whether it was truly acceptable for them to discuss eliminating Yeowun on their own initiative. Jin Yun-mu asserted that Muyeon had already delegated all external matters to him while he devoted himself solely to refining his own martial arts. He warned that if Yeowun was allowed to continue unopposed, their opportunity to take him down could be lost entirely. Shin-guk acknowledged Jin Yun's point, but reminded him that Yeowun was the one who had defeated the chief of the Poison Sect, questioning what they could realistically do against someone like that. He suggested that instead of confronting Yeowun directly, they should focus on recruiting the 10 cadets who had not yet chosen a leader to follow. Jin Yun-mu agreed that continued recruitment was essential. He stated that they at least needed to secure the support of Sama Chuk of the Warrior Dance Sect and Hwan Ya of the Flying Phantom Sect. With their backing, he believed they would gain a decisive advantage. He emphasized that their fathers were the 9th Elder, Sama Yi, and the 11th Elder, Hwan Yi, known as the Phantom of 1,000 Faces. Shin-guk expressed that he understood the value of recruiting Sama Chuk, but questioned the need to recruit Hwan Ya as well. Jin Yun-mu replied that they were in no position to be selective. He revealed that according to recent information, Yeowun had sealed himself inside his personal training chamber. He declared this their opportunity to cut off Yeowun's resources and eliminate him. Shin-guk reacted in alarm, pointing out that 2 other candidates had already lost their limbs after provoking Yeowun's followers, and that Chun Jung-sum had suffered complete destruction of his lower abdomen after attempting to interfere with Baek-ji. Jin Yun-mu replied that they would not confront Yeowun directly. He stated that they would use the classic tactic of turning enemies against one another and avoid facing that monster themselves. Shin-guk questioned who Jin Yun-mu intended to pit against Yeowun. Jin Yun-mu revealed that there were 4 individuals who harbored deep hatred toward Yeowun. Shin-guk realized who he meant, and with that, their plan was set into motion. The following afternoon, Yeowun was immersed in training inside an adamantine training room. Through the sword techniques left behind by the Sword Demon and the blade formations of the Berserk Saber God that Nano had traced, he had acquired a total of 6 blood formations. Yeowun erupted with triumphant laughter as he acknowledged that Nano had successfully recreated the Berserk Saber God's first codified fighting form. Through Nano's extractions of the techniques and saber marks left behind by the Berserk Saber God, Yeowun had learned 6 forms in total. However, he was unable to complete them fully due to the absence of a proper chi circulation technique. Even so, he did not give up. During 3 years and 3 months of isolated training, Nano analyzed and researched countless martial arts forms. Through this process, Nano generated innumerable simulations of chi circulation techniques capable of drawing out the true power of specific codified fighting forms. From these results, Nano ultimately formulated versions that were as stable as, and in some cases even more stable than, the original techniques. Yeowun reflected that if the Sword Demon were still alive, he would surely be astonished to witness a technique being replicated solely from saber marks. Nano immediately began analyzing the chi circulation technique for the second codified fighting form. Although Yeowun's energy had recovered, his hunger remained unaddressed. With evening approaching, he ended his training for the day and left the training room. As he entered the cafeteria, a sharp, spicy aroma filled the air. A massive pot of red soup, rich with meat, mushrooms, and various vegetables, dominated the space and spread its scent throughout the room. Yeowun stepped forward with his bowl, and a worker filled it from the pot before handing it to him. The worker shook his head repeatedly, drawing Yeowun's attention. Yeowun asked if he was alright, and the worker explained that he was fine, only overwhelmed by the heat of standing before the pot all day. As Yeowun took the bowl and turned away, someone in the corner of the cafeteria watched him closely. That observer saw Yeowun sit down with a puzzled expression as he stared into the soup. Yeowun sampled it with his chopsticks. After lightly tasting it with his tongue, he frowned for a moment, but then lifted the bowl and began drinking the soup in earnest. The hidden watcher grinned in satisfaction. Later that evening, 12 cadets gathered by the wall near the torchlight. They were members of Yeowun's group. They discussed among themselves whether their lord would skip dinner again that night, whether he ate at least once every other day, and whether he might be at the cafeteria after not being seen there the previous day. Munko sighed, thinking that if Sanghwa and Baek-ji returned sooner, they might finally be able to share a meal with Yeowun. Wang-hul inwardly observed that Munko seemed to be growing just as fond of their lord as Hobum was. He briefly drifted into an overly personal line of thought before realizing it and shaking his head to clear it. Moments later, Baek-ji and the others emerged as well. Munko muttered that Baek-ji was late again, and Baek-ji avoided his gaze in awkward silence. Hobum, having already given up on commenting on Baek-ji's tardiness, noted noted that at least he was earlier than the previous day and suggested they go eat. As they started down the southern road, their path was suddenly blocked. More than 20 cadets led by Shin-guk emerged from the training hall and cut off their way. Meanwhile, after finishing his meal and heading back toward his dormitory, Yeowun was intercepted by 4 men. He immediately recognized them as familiar figures: King Po of the Sword Clan, Hang Yujik of the Sound Clan, Bu Yankang of the Blade Clan, and Baek Churku of the Poison Clan. Yeowun noted that it would have been an even greater spectacle had members of the Stealth and Shadow sects also been present. Baek Churku glared with burning hostility and erupted in rage over the destruction of Chun Jong-som's lower abdomen and the death of his grandfather. Yankang unsheathed his blade and declared that someone of Yeowun's low blood had no right to claim the minor priesthood, demanding that he know his place. Hang Yujik also drew his sword and assumed a ready stance. Only King Po, still bearing injuries from earlier, hesitated. Yeowun responded with a calm smile, observing that the 4 of them believed that joining forces could give them a chance against him. He remarked that it seemed they had prepared something in advance. Baek Churku inwardly sneered and revealed the truth of his scheme. He had poisoned Yeowun's food earlier with chi-splitting poison infused with his own poison essence. The poison had been applied not only through the food, but even through the ladle used to scoop the soup. Churku took pride in the fact that no one would ever suspect the familiar cafeteria cook as the source. He explained that while external poison could be blocked with defensive energy, poison that had already been swallowed could not be stopped. Because of the chi-splitting poison, Yeowun would be unable to draw out his internal energy for 6 full hours, and the poison infused with the essence of the destructive demonic poison state would melt him from the inside, leading to a slow and agonizing death. Baek Churku laughed in confidence, believing Yeowun's composure to be meaningless. He was certain that Yeowun would soon join his followers in the infirmary, if he even managed to survive the encounter at all. Yeowun's eyes narrowed the moment he heard his followers being mentioned. He immediately suspected that the Shadow Sect might be involved, and the possibility that Chun Muyan was part of it made his expression turn grim. Without hesitation, Yeowun reached behind his back and drew the White Dragon blade. There was no time to delay. He declared that he would end it quickly. Hang Yujik of the Sound Clan, enraged over his sister's injury, charged first. His sword collided with Yeowun's saber and was instantly split in half. Yujik froze in shock, but before he could react further, Yeowun vanished from sight and shot past him in an instant. Yujik's arm was severed, and blood burst from the wound as he collapsed in agony. Yeowun glanced back coldly, reinforcing that he had no time to waste. Yujik writhed on the ground in disbelief and pain, while Churku's face trembled with terror. Churku sensed advanced chi flow and could not comprehend how it was possible after witnessing Yeowun consume the poisoned soup. Yeowun raised his hand above the fallen Yujik and twisted his fingers in the air. Black liquid seeped from his palm and dripped onto Yujik's thigh. The moment it made contact, the flesh burned violently as thick smoke rose from the wound. It was pure poison. Yeowun stared at the 4 with icy eyes and made it clear that their scheme had failed. When Yeowun had earlier tasted the soup with his chopsticks, he had already ordered Nano to analyze it. Nano had detected a harmful poison that disrupted the flow of internal energy. Yeowun had immediately realized that once their plan failed, the true mastermind would never reveal himself. He then asked Nano whether it could halt the spread of the poison and instead gather it into a single point within his body. Nano confirmed that it was possible. Yeowun drained the entire remaining bowl in one motion and instructed Nano to keep the gathered poison confined to a single point until further notice. Nano immediately confirmed compliance. In the present, Baek Churku stood frozen in shock. He was horrified as he realized that Yeowun had consumed the full dose of chi-splitting poison, and yet had still managed to gather it all and expel it at once, something he believed to be impossible even for the strongest experts. His disbelief shook him to the core. Before any of them could react, Yeowun vanished. In the next instant, he appeared directly behind Bu Yankang. His movement was so fast that none of them could even perceive it. After mastering the Step of the Wind God from Great Guardian Markim, Yeowun's speed had reached an entirely different level. Churku shouted a warning, but it was already too late. Yeowun's palm struck Yankang's back in rapid succession, unleashing 8 devastating blows in an instant. Yankang vomited blood as his body was hurled away by the impact. King Po recoiled in terror, instinctively stepping backward. Panic surged through him as he realized there was no escape from Yeowun's wrath, especially with the chest injury he still carried from their previous encounter. Yeowun coldly approached the fallen Yankang and raised his foot above his head. Yankang desperately protested, but Yeowun brought his foot down without hesitation. Yankang's skull was crushed under the stomp, and blood exploded outward. King Po and Churku turned deathly pale at the sight of the brutal execution. They had never imagined that Yeowun would kill so decisively and mercilessly. Yeowun then shifted his gaze toward the remaining two and declared that it was now time to deal with the rest of them. Kingpo's heart pounded in terror as overwhelming dread consumed him. When Yeowun unleashed his internal energy, the sheer terrifying power washing over Kingpo shattered his will completely, and he became convinced that none of them would leave the place alive. Desperate to overturn the situation, Churku shouted in panic and rage, denouncing Yeowun's actions as madness and warning him of the inevitable fury of the six clans. Yeowun replied coldly that fear was not something he needed to harbor. As he extended his hand, an object on the ground was lifted by his precise control of energy, suspended in the air, and instantly shot forward toward Kingpo. Yujik's broken sword pierced straight through Kingpo's chest. Kingpo staggered and collapsed to the ground in agony as Churku screamed in fury at the sight. Yeowun responded with icy calm, stating that if he had feared them, he would never have acted in the first place. With that, Yeowun launched himself directly toward Churku. After roughly 30 minutes, Yeowun had finished dealing with all 4 cadets from the 6 clans and immediately moved to locate his own group. He sensed multiple energy signatures rushing rapidly toward him. Moments later, his followers appeared from the direction of the approaching energies. Monku released a heavy sigh of relief upon seeing that Yeowun was unharmed and expressed gratitude that they had found him safely. Yeowun stated that he was unharmed and immediately asked whether Cheon Yeowun's followers had ambushed them. Wang Hul reacted in surprise and questioned how Yeowun had known. Moments earlier, Shinguk and his group had confronted them. Shinguk had spoken confidently, asserting that no matter how strong Yeowun was within the academy, the protection of its walls would not extend beyond it. He had claimed that once Yeowun left the academy, he would be unable to withstand not only the 6 sects, but also the other high-ranking sects. Shinguk had emphasized that Cheon Yeowun was generous enough to accept everyone and had warned them not to ruin themselves by placing their trust in Yeowun. Hobam had immediately rejected those words with open hostility, making it clear that they had no intention of bowing their heads to the Shadow Sect. He had also warned Shinguk to be careful with Yeowun's name, stating that Yeowun was now an elder. Shinguk had responded by mocking Hobam as a weakling from a low-ranked sect. Hobam had challenged him directly, provoking him into a confrontation. Shinguk had reacted angrily, but Jinyun Mu stepped in at once and restrained him, stating that they were not there to fight. Wang Hul had then firmly declared that Yeowun was not alone and that they were prepared to sacrifice their lives for him at any moment. Jinyun Mu had observed that Yeowun seemed to possess remarkable fortune in gathering such loyal followers and had once again attempted to persuade them to defect, suggesting that the offer would be beneficial. After delivering those words, Shinguk's group withdrew. In the present, Yeowun expressed surprise that they had left without forcing a confrontation. Wang Hul replied that although they had initially acted aggressively, they had retreated almost immediately, likely because of the strong hostility shown in response. Yeowun silently organized the situation in his mind. Descendants from 4 of the 6 sects had joined forces to set a trap to kill him, yet only the Shadow Sect had approached his followers with an offer. He concluded that the so-called proposal had never been an attempt at recruitment and that it had merely been a method to buy time. Yeowun then stated that their true intention was to pit their enemies against one another. His followers reacted with clear confusion at his conclusion. Later that night, inside one of the adamantine stone training rooms, Jinyun Mu expressed satisfaction, stating that everything had unfolded exactly as expected and that regardless of whether Yeowun lived or died, they would lose nothing. He laughed as he spoke. Muyan responded with restrained caution, remarking that the outcome was still uncertain, especially since Yeowun had endured the poison of a true poison master. Jinyun Mu dismissed the concern and explained that either result favored them. If Yeowun died from the poison crafted by the poison sect, Muyan would automatically become the final victor of the minor priesthood. If Yeowun survived, there was no chance he would allow the matter to pass, given his vicious nature, and that would inevitably draw the wrath of the remaining 4 sects upon him. Muyan clenched his teeth inwardly, acknowledging that even if Yeowun survived, they could still preserve their reputation by claiming that they had denounced the poison sect's underhanded tactics. However, the fact that they were forced to rely on outside forces simply because they could not defeat Yeowun and his followers directly filled him with deep humiliation. Jinyun Mu continued, praising the scenario as a perfect execution of turning enemies against one another to achieve their goal, noting that he had learned yet another valuable lesson through this scheme. At that precise moment, someone pounded heavily on the thick door of the training room. The room had been clearly marked as occupied. Muyan gave a silent nod and Jinyun Mu moved to the door and opened it. As the door opened, senior instructor Ho-jin Chang revealed himself under the light of numerous torches. He was not alone. Many other instructors stood behind him with their swords drawn and ready. Jin Yeon-moo stammered in shock as he recognized Jin Chang. Jin Chang announced that both of them were under arrest and ordered them to be brought to the chief's office. He stated that he wished to proceed peacefully and warned them not to resist as he drew his sword as well. Muyeon and Jin Yeon were escorted out of the training room under the encirclement of more than 40 instructors. As they were led away, a thick stench of blood filled the cold air. Jin Yeon sensed it immediately, and his eyes trembled when he realized what it meant. The cadets who had planned to ambush Cheon Yeowun were now lying dead. He could not understand what had happened or why they had been killed. Hameng stepped forward and stood before the two of them. He addressed them directly by their titles, and both Muyeon and Jin Yeon bowed politely in response. Hameng then demanded an answer in a furious tone, asking whether the two of them were responsible for what had occurred. Jin Yeon hastily denied any involvement, claiming complete ignorance. Muyeon likewise stated that both of them had been in the personal training rooms and had been brought out only under official orders. He insisted that they had been unaware of anything happening outside and expressed confusion at being accused. Hameng gestured for them to follow him. As they moved through the ring of instructors, the first corpse came into view. One of the legs had been melted away, and one arm was severed. Jin Yeon recognized the body as Hang Yujik of the Sound Clan. The cause of death was massive blood loss, and his face had turned black, making it clear that poison had also been involved. Lee Hameng then guided them to another body. Jin Yeon immediately recognized King Po. A shattered sword fragment had pierced through King Po's chest. The embedded weapon was the broken remains of a sword from the Sword Clan. From the positioning of the wounds, it appeared as though King Po and Yujik had killed each other in battle. At that moment, Jin Yeon realized that something had gone terribly wrong. Lee Hameng then pointed toward a body lying about 15 steps away. At the sight of it, Jin Yeon-moo nearly retched. The third corpse had its head half crushed, with blood and brain matter scattered across the ground. Its upper garments had been torn away, revealing 8 distinct palm imprints etched into the back. Cold sweat ran down Jin Yeon's face. Muyeon was equally shaken when he recognized the markings. There was no mistaking it. Those were the imprints of the 8th formation of the energy hand, the flowing dark cloud palm of the Shadow Sect. In that instant, both of them grasped the full implication of the scene. They understood exactly why they had been named suspects. Jin Yeon tried to speak in their defense, but Muyeon immediately stopped him through a telepathic transmission. Muyeon conveyed that it was a trap. When Jin Yeon questioned it silently, Muyeon reminded him that the skill book for the Wise Energy Hand was kept on the 5th floor of the library. At that, Jin Yeon understood. Muyeon told him to remain still and let him handle it, and Jin Yeon agreed. Jin Yeon inwardly acknowledged that Yeowun had executed a clever scheme, yet he also judged that using the flowing dark cloud palm had been a mistake. As Muyeon had realized, Yeowun had indeed learned that technique after passing the 5th examination. To anyone investigating, that alone could point suspicion toward him. Lee Hameng then instructed them to proceed to the final body. As they approached the farthest corpse, Jin Yeon forced himself to remain composed, but the moment he saw it, his composure shattered. The last body was baked Churku. The upper half of his body was also exposed, and upon it were the unmistakable traces of 2 different formations: palm wounds from the flowing dark cloud palm, and sword wounds from the destructive demonic shadow sword. Muyeon clenched his fist tightly as realization struck him. He identified the work as that of the sword left hand. Among the 6 sects, the Shadow Sect stood above all others. Jinwon-mu, the first elder and chief of the Shadow Sect, ranked 2nd among the greatest martial artists of the entire cult. His ability allowed him to wield 2 techniques simultaneously: sword techniques with one hand and palm techniques with the other, switching freely between them. Within the Shadow Sect, only 2 individuals were known to possess this dual-hand mastery: Jinwon-mu and Chun Muyeon himself. Muyeon had previously displayed this very technique during the 3rd examination when he attempted to seize one of the yellow badges. Muyeon was inwardly bewildered as the truth struck him. He could not comprehend how Yeowun had recreated that technique after witnessing it only once 3 years ago. Even his own grandfather had been incapable of such a feat, yet Yeowun had accomplished it. Jin Yeon-mu immediately protested, insisting that the situation had to be a trap. He declared that Muyeon had been training continuously and that he himself had been with him in the training room just moments earlier. He argued that there was no possible way Muyeon could have killed these men. Lee Hameng's glare sharpened at Jin Yeon's words. He questioned what Jin Yeon meant by calling it a trap, and and pointed out that Jin Yeowun seemed to know far more than he should about why all these people had gathered there. Jin Yeowun found himself unable to respond. He realized inwardly that they were cornered. To clear their names, they would have to admit their own involvement, and if Muyan were expelled because of it, Yeowun would seize the minor priesthood uncontested. Jin Yeowun resolved that Muyan must not be expelled under any circumstances. Lee Ha-meng declared that making excuses without solid evidence only made them appear more suspicious, and ordered the instructors to take them away. In desperation, Jin Yeowun shouted that it had all been Cheon Yeowun's scheme and that Yeowun had orchestrated everything. At that signal, Lee Ha-meng ordered the instructors to halt. Muyan sighed inwardly, realizing that he had warned Jin Yeowun to remain silent, but the situation had now passed the point of restraint. Jin Yeowun then began to explain what had supposedly happened, altering details to suit himself. Since all the cadets involved were already dead, he placed the entire blame on them. He claimed that he had refused to participate because it had not been a fair competition, reasoning that killing them served no benefit. He added that if Muyan were expelled, they would lose their chance to compete altogether, and insisted that they had only discovered the bodies upon arriving there. Lee Ha-meng listened to the account with a strange expression. He then coldly stated that Jin Yeowun must take him for a fool, thinking he could fabricate any story simply because the corpses could not speak, and demanded to know who Jin Yeowun believed had discovered the bodies. Jin Yeowun answered in confusion, assuming it had been the instructors. Lee Ha-meng corrected him by revealing that Elder Yeowun himself had come directly to report the incident, accompanied by his other captains and wardens. Jin Yeowun Mu was struck dumb by the revelation. He could not accept that Yeowun had been the one to report the incident, and demanded to know why Yeowun would do such a thing if he were truly the culprit. At that moment, a calm voice questioned why Yeowun was being treated as a suspect. Both Jin Yeowun and Muyan turned toward the source and were shocked to see Cheon Yeowun standing there. As Yeowun stepped forward, all of the instructors immediately bowed deeply and addressed him with full respect as Elder Cheon. Lee Ha-meng sternly ordered Muyan and Jin Yeowun to show their respect as well. When they hesitated, his anger flared, and he repeated the command. Muyan clenched his teeth but forced himself to bow, addressing Yeowun as Elder Cheon, and Jin Yeowun followed with visible reluctance. Yeowun smiled faintly and addressed Muyan, referring to the claim that the poison, saber, musician, and sword sects had set a trap, and that he himself had killed all of them. He then requested permission to examine the bodies more closely. The instructors immediately agreed and guided him forward. As they did, the instructors explained their findings. They concluded that Captain Yujik's arm had been severed by Captain Bu Yankong's saber technique, and that he had then been poisoned by Captain Shirku's poison. They further reported that Captain Kingpo had been killed by a direct piercing through the heart with Captain Yujik's secret demon sound sword. Upon hearing this, Muyan's eyes trembled. He had believed this incident was meant solely to frame Yeowun. Ho Jin-chang added that, judging by the wounds, Captain Yankong's death had resulted from what appeared to be the Shadow Sect's flowing dark cloud palm, followed by the crushing of his head. Lee Ha-meng then delivered the final conclusion, stating that Captain Baek had died from internal injuries and massive blood loss after being struck by the Shadow Sect's secret technique of the right sword left palm. Yeowun calmly pointed out that if he truly had been the one who killed them as Muyan claimed, then it would mean he had flawlessly mastered a wide range of unrelated martial arts. However, based on the professor's deductions, what remained at the scene was nothing more than a massacre caused by those 5 men turning their weapons on one another. Muyan's eyes widened as realization struck him, and rage surged through him. He understood at last why he had felt such deep unease from the beginning. At first, he had believed Yeowun was merely trying to eliminate him as the final remaining rival for the minor priesthood, but once the bodies were returned to their respective sects, each sect would inevitably determine the killer by analyzing the wounds left on their disciples. Through that, Muyan realized that Yeowun's true objective had been to pit the 5 sects against one another. He recognized that Yeowun had used their own strategy against them. As Lee Ha-meng observed their shaken and frustrated expressions, a cold grin formed on his face. He then ordered the instructors to arrest both Muyan and Jin Yeowun and place them in the prison cave. The instructors immediately acknowledged the command and moved to carry it out. At the Academy's deputy office, Ho Jin-chang reported that the 4 bodies had been sent back to their respective sects. He added that official notices had also been dispatched, stating that Cheon Muyan and Jin Yeowun Mu would be confined in the detention center until the Patriarch and the Elders return. Lee Ha-meng remarked on the chilling precision of the scheme, noting that no one could have uncovered the truth simply by examining the bodies. He admitted that even he was curious about the exact details. As he reflected further, he acknowledged that not even a Genesis master could perfectly recreate a modified fighting form after seeing it only once, especially not a secret technique such as the Shadow Sect's left sword right palm. Regardless, he concluded that this incident would inevitably tear open a rift between the 5 sects. The Patriarch had long sought to weaken those sects through careful pressure, but it was Yeowun, acting within the academy itself, who had shattered their balance. Lee Ha-meng recognized that Yeowun had fully matured, and he believed that the dawn of the true Patriarch the Sword Demon had long awaited was finally approaching. Meanwhile, at a mansion in the western region of the demonic cult, the leaders of the Poison Clan gathered, all dressed in white mourning robes. Lady Jo stood before her son's coffin, wailing in grief over Churku's death. Her cries fueled the rage of Baek Munsu, the eldest son of Baek-oh, who clenched his teeth and declared that he could no longer restrain himself. He had intended to wait until their father's funeral was complete, but this outrage had crossed the line. Baek-chow clenched his fist in agreement and declared that they could no longer allow the Shadow Sect to toy with them. He reminded everyone that their chief had refused to participate in the 6th examination after Lady Mu of the Shadow Sect had visited, and yet she had still had the audacity to appear at his funeral. Baek Munsu affirmed that the Shadow Sect had looked down upon the Poison Sect, and he vowed that only when her head was taken would the spirits of their chief and Churku finally find rest. Baek Mungwung apologized for speaking during the period of mourning, but stated that this moment represented their best opportunity. Baek Chow supported him, declaring that the chief of the Shadow Sect and half of their manpower were currently absent, and under such conditions, the Poison Clan finally stood a real chance. Another voice emphasized that the Shadow Sect would assume they were fully occupied with funerals and mourning, making this the perfect time to strike. Baek Munsu clenched his fists in burning rage and made the decision. Churku's funeral would be conducted first. By 2 in the morning of the following day, their scattered forces across the cult would be secretly gathered. At 4 in the morning, their vengeance would begin at the Shadow Sect's manor. When the appointed time arrived, Baek Munsu, cloaked in white, led the assault. With the Shadow Sect's chief absent, he judged it the ideal moment to annihilate them in a single decisive strike. At his command, the assembled warriors surged forward toward the Shadow Sect's courtyard. Suddenly, they halted in confusion and scanned their surroundings. Baek Chow sensed danger. Despite having reached the manor itself, not a single guard or defender was visible. In that instant, realization struck Baek Munsu. It was a trap. He turned to warn the others, but the warning came too late. A storm of arrows rained down upon them without mercy. Baek Munsu slashed several aside while recognizing that the arrows were infused with internal energy and ordered his men to evade at all costs. The effort proved futile. The empowered arrows pierced straight through their defenses, cutting down warriors instantly. Within moments, most of the attacking force collapsed lifeless to the ground, with only a handful left standing amid the slaughter. Baek Chow gasped in fury, cursing the Shadow Sect for what they had done. Baek Munsu realized in shock that the ambush had been anticipated from the very beginning. With no path left for retreat, he resolved to fight to the bitter end alongside the remaining warriors. In the next instant, warriors of the Shadow Sect emerged and launched a coordinated assault. Baek Munsu and the surviving members of the Poison Clan fought back with desperate determination, driven by rage and grief. However, the tide of battle shifted completely with the sudden appearance of an old man. The old man calmly observed the scene and remarked inwardly on how even a cornered rat would bare its fangs against a cat. One of the Poison Clan warriors rushed at him wielding paired swords. With a mere flick of his wrist, the old man's internal energy surged forward and struck the attacker dead on the spot. He then drew his sword and, with a single sweeping strike, cut down dozens of Poison Clan soldiers at once. He coldly regarded the remaining fighters as nothing more than insignificant vermin. Baek Munsu charged at him in a violent counterattack, unleashing multiple strikes with all his strength. The old man repelled every blow effortlessly without taking a single step back. He then identified Baek Munsu as the minor chief of the Poison Sect and dismissed him with contempt before piercing both of his shoulders. Blood poured from the wounds as Baek Munsu screamed in agony, and despair spread through the remaining warriors as they witnessed their leader being overwhelmed. At that moment, another presence entered the battlefield. A woman veiled in red stepped forward. It was Lady Mu. She observed the scene with detached indifference, finding the outcome entirely predictable. The Poison Clan had truly believed that the temporary absence of the Shadow Sect's chief would be enough to give them superiority. Driven by hatred, Baek Chow and Baek Mungwung lunged at Lady Mu in a suicidal assault. In a blur of motion faster than the human eye could follow, Lady Mu moved. With a single clean slash, she severed both of their necks at once. Their bodies collapsed instantly. Baek Munsu watched in helpless dread as his two brothers fell dead before his eyes. Before he could react, the old man appeared directly behind him and seized his head firmly, sealing his fate. The old man smirked and forced Baek Munsu down onto his knees, leaving him as the only survivor among the Poison Sect warriors. Munso trembled marveled in disbelief, realizing too late that the shadow sect was filled with monsters beyond anything he had imagined. Lady Mu stepped in front of him, and Munsu shivered as he glared up at her. He admitted that he had thought of her only as the patriarch's first concubine, and now understood that she had been hiding her true strength all along. Lady Mu slid her veil aside and smiled, stating that she had never been hiding anything and had simply not displayed her abilities. Munsu tried to retort in rage, but before he could finish, her blade moved in a clean arc and severed his neck. She calmly remarked that there had been no joke in her words. Not long after, a report came in that all of the poison sect warriors who had infiltrated the manor had been eliminated. Lady Mu acknowledged the success, but noted that it was unfortunate they would no longer be able to make use of the poison sect. One of the shadow sect members voiced concern that if the poison sect had been bold enough to attempt such an ambush, the saber sect might also act. Lady Mu dismissed the worry, explaining that without direct orders from their chief, the saber sect would not move. The subordinate then offered to send messengers to the academy the next morning to retrieve the young masters. Lady Mu refused and ordered them to be left where they were, stating that Muyan needed time to reflect on his actions. When the subordinate hesitated at the idea of leaving the young master in such a place, she cut him off and asserted that she understood her child better than anyone. She judged that Muyan had overestimated himself and had been ensnared by his own enemy, and that he needed to correct himself. She had intended to teach him that the position of patriarch was a difficult burden to bear, and now she saw this as the perfect opportunity. She then gave a new order. All manpower of the shadow sect was to be mobilized to investigate everything about Yeowun. The investigation was to begin with guard Jang, who had once taken care of him, and extend to every expelled student from the academy. She demanded that not a single detail be overlooked. The old man asked whether Lady Mu was okay. She confirmed that she was, but acknowledged that she had been deceived by Yeowun, and declared inwardly that he had now become far too dangerous to merely be observed. She judged that his strength had surpassed even Muyan's ability to confront him, and resolved that she would have to take action personally. 4 days passed after the deaths of the 4 sect descendants. Chun Mo-yeon and Jin Yun-mu were confined in isolation within the detention center with their internal energies completely sealed. In the aftermath, chaos spread through Mu-yeon's faction. The followers who had once sworn their loyalty to support his bid for the minor priesthood withdrew from his group one after another. Those who remained found themselves powerless, as the academy had fallen entirely under Yeowun's control. With no path left inside the academy, they chose to withdraw of their own accord and declared that they would support Muyan from the outside instead. The 7 students who left Muyan's faction, along with 5 unaffiliated students from high-ranking sects who had not previously supported anyone, then came forward to pledge their allegiance to Yeowun. However, Yeowun valued loyalty above all else. Because of that, he was not convinced by their sudden pledges and rejected every one of them. Only Sama Chuk of the Warrior Dance sect and Sahum Lee of the low-ranking Sea Saber sect were accepted. They had sworn their loyalty to Yeowun before the incident involving the 4 sect descendants, and their allegiance had already been proven. Che Takim and several cadets gathered before Yeowun to persuade him. They insisted that he must accept the remaining 5. Takim argued that rejecting Muyan's former followers was understandable, but emphasized that the other 5 were different. He acknowledged Yeowun's unease over the fact that they had remained neutral until now, but stressed that Yeowun required the support of at least 12 high-ranking sect chiefs to be inducted into the minor priesthood. With those 5, the minimum requirement could finally be met. Sanghwa voiced agreement with Takim's reasoning and supported the push for acceptance. Takim reinforced that securing Yeowun's ascension to the minor priesthood must take absolute priority. Yeowun refused and stated that he would find another way. Takim reacted in disbelief, pointing out that only 2 days had passed since Yeowun had learned from the deputy that 12 high-ranking sect chiefs were required for his induction into the minor priesthood. Sanghwa questioned whether another path truly existed. Yeowun then declared that he would be leaving the academy starting that very day. Shock spread instantly through all the gathered cadets at the unexpected announcement. Yeowun explained that he had 2 reasons for departing early. The first was to recruit people outside the academy to expand his following. The second was because the patriarch and 8 of the elders were currently away in Murim. Sanghwa grew uneasy and pointed out that this meant the 5 chiefs of the main sects were also absent, fearing that Yeowun might be taking an enormous risk. Wang Hul assured everyone that Yeowun would not be leaving the academy alone. At that, the group realized that Wang Hul himself intended to go with him. Mungku immediately declared that he would also accompany Yeowun, followed by Baek-ji, who made the same decision without hesitation. Sama-chuk joined with open enthusiasm, admitting that he still had much to improve, but vowing to protect Yeowun regardless. Wang-hul apologized for the news coming so suddenly. The remaining cadets, moved by the situation, expressed their desire to go as well. Yeowun acknowledged their fierce loyalty, but stated that if they truly wished to be of use to him, they needed to remain behind and refine their martial arts before leaving the academy. His words made them realize that they were not yet strong enough to stand at his side in the battles ahead. They understood that he was urging them to grow stronger, and having spent a long time with Yeowun, they fully grasped his meaning. With renewed determination, all of them resolved to become far more powerful for Yeowun's sake, and for the future that awaited them. Jin-guk noticed that Hobum would be the most affected. He turned toward him and gently lowered his head, trying to steady his trembling spirits and ease his disappointment. At that moment, Hobum suddenly sprang upright. With tear-filled eyes, he turned toward the cadets who would remain behind and shouted that he would take care of their young lord, and urged them not to worry, telling them to come out soon as well. The cadets who were staying behind stared at him in confusion. In a sudden display of dramatics, Hobum clung tightly to Yeowun's arm and cried out that he must always remain by his lord's side and had to follow him out, pleading not to be stopped. Wang-hul covered his eyes and shook his head in resignation, telling Hobum to remain quiet until they had actually left the academy. However, Hobum had already drawn too much attention. The remaining cadets burst into loud objections, questioning how Yeowun could take Hobum while ordering them to stay behind. They reminded him that he had told them to grow stronger first. Only then did Hobum realize his blunder and freeze in place. Dumbfounded, Yeowun told Hobum to handle the situation himself and calmly departed the scene. Hobum was left behind, spending hours trying to placate the others. Later that night, after dinner, a large mansion stood quietly on the southwest side of the demonic cult's castle. It was the manor of the Flying Phantom sect. Two guards wearing pale, skin-colored masks stood watch at the gate. They soon noticed 6 young figures approaching, 5 men and 1 woman, all in their late teens. Among them, one presence stood out sharply from the rest. The guards halted them, stating that they had never seen them before and demanded to know their business. Yeowun stepped forward and presented his medallion. He requested that they inform the 11th elder, Hwan Yi, that the 12th elder, Cheon Yeowun, sought an audience with him. The guards immediately bowed in deep respect upon recognizing Yeowun's status as the 12th elder and hurried to relay his arrival to their chief, asking him to wait briefly. As they stood before the eerie manor, Hobum inwardly felt unsettled by the ghostly atmosphere, and Wang-hul silently shared the same impression. Mungku observed that although he had visited this place as a child with his grandfather, he had never realized how unsettling it truly was. He quietly wondered whether their lord would be able to persuade the 11th elder and felt a faint regret that his grandfather was not present. Moments later, the door creaked open and a figure dressed in heavy white makeup and crimson lips stepped out, introducing himself as Nu Yayin, the advisor to the elders. His androgynous appearance left Hobum and Baekji inwardly confused. Yayin reached toward Wang-hul, having mistaken him for the 12th elder. Wang-hul corrected the misunderstanding and indicated Yeowun instead. Yayin reacted with a graceful, almost feminine laugh, quickly bowing in apology and formally greeting Yeowun. Yeowun returned the bow in silence. Yayin conveyed that his master had requested Yeowun be escorted to the guest house for refreshments and invited him inside. However, when Yeowun attempted to enter with his companions, the guards halted them. Yayin then explained that his master wished to meet Yeowun alone and apologized, stating that the 11th elder was an extremely private individual, requesting their understanding. Wang-hul objected, stating that separating them in such a manner made him uneasy about Yeowun's safety. Nu Yayin responded with playful amusement, commenting on Wang-hul's loyalty and assuring him that the chief was a well-mannered individual who would never disrespect an elder of the cult. As a compromise, Yayin allowed one companion to accompany Yeowun, explaining that permitting more would invite severe punishment from his master. Hobum reacted in disbelief at being restricted to just one. Mungku immediately volunteered to accompany Yeowun. Nu Yayin accepted the choice with a pleasant smile and led the two of them inside. As Yeowun and Mungku passed through the massive doors, they entered a courtyard filled with scattered stone formations and straw dolls dressed in white garments. Yeowun found the atmosphere unsettling and sensed that the interior felt even more eerie than the outside. Nu Yayin announced their arrival at the front of the guest house. Inside, a wide open area held a large table. 7 middle-aged men dressed in identical blue silk garments were seated around it. Every one of them bore the exact same face. Yeowun recognized this as the work of Hwan Yi, the Phantom of 1,000 Faces, famed for his mastery of skin masks. Even so, he had not expected the disguises to be so flawless that the men appeared completely identical. One of the 7 rose from his seat and formally introduced himself as Hwan Yi, the chief of the Flying Phantom sect. Munku became visibly confused when she saw Hwan Yi's face. It was completely different from the one she remembered. She immediately sent a telepathic message to Yeowun, informing him that the man before them looked nothing like the Hwan Yi she recalled. Yeowun formally introduced himself as Cheon Yeowun, the newly appointed 12th Elder. Hwan Yi acknowledged that he was already aware and invited him to sit and partake in refreshments as they spoke. Munku then introduced herself as Munku of the Demonic Dragon Palm sect and greeted Hwan Yi as her uncle. At that moment, one of the identical men seated at the table subtly turned his head toward her. The man who had introduced himself as Hwan Yi immediately responded, recalling that he had last seen Munku with her elder brother before she entered the academy, and noting that she had grown well since then. Munku was relieved that he remembered her. Through telepathy, she confirmed to Yeowun that this individual was indeed the real Elder Hwan Yi, as he alone knew of her use of skin masks. Yeowun acknowledged this silently. Yeowun then stated that Hwan Yi already knew the reason for his visit. Hwan Yi correctly inferred that Yeowun had come to obtain his jade medallion. Yeowun acknowledged that he did. Hwan Yi further stated that since Yeowun wanted to win the grand tournament for the minor priesthood, it was only natural for him to come seeking this audience immediately after leaving the academy. Hwan Yi then explained the two methods of ascending to the minor priesthood. One required the induction of the candidate by 12 chiefs of high-ranking sects. The other required the acknowledgement of 3 of the 12 elders. He explained that the jade medallion served as the official symbols of the elder's authority, and that an elder offering such a medallion to a candidate signified both formal recognition of that candidate as minor priest and a pledge of loyalty. Yeowun stated that from that moment on, he would no longer address Hwan Yi as a fellow elder. He requested a private meeting with him solely as a candidate for the minor priesthood. Hwan Yi replied that he had been treating Yeowun as a candidate from the very beginning. Yeowun expressed surprise at this. Hwan Yi explained that the jade medallion symbolized loyalty to the one it was bestowed upon. For that reason, the elders were permitted to test a candidate to determine whether they were worthy. He stated that he had intended to give Yeowun sometime during their conversation, but since Yeowun had gone straight to the point, he would do the same. He declared the first test to be one of observation and challenged Yeowun to identify the true chief of the Flying Phantom sect among those present. Munku inwardly concluded that the test was extremely difficult. The skin masks were crafted with such perfection that every detail matched exactly, from wrinkles to beard shape. Even the energy emitted by each individual was identical. These were not only the finest skin masks Hwan Yi had ever made, but the men themselves had clearly trained for years to mimic his actions and demeanor. Even with the sharpest senses, distinguishing the real one from the fakes would not be easy. Hwan Yi began to suggest that they take their time with tea and refreshments while Yeowun observed more carefully. Before he could finish, Yeowun declared that he had already found him. The sudden announcement stunned the elder. Yeowun's gaze was fixed in a direction that did not include any of the 7 identical Hwan Yis seated at the table. The person he was staring at was Nu Yayin, who stood near the entrance of the guest house. Yayin reacted in confusion and disbelief at being singled out. Munku immediately sent Yeowun a telepathic message in shock, pointing out that the elder had instructed him to find the real one among those seated. Yeowun replied that Hwan Yi had only said to find him within the guest house, and had never specified that the real Hwan Yi must be among the 7 at the table. Realization dawned on Munku at that explanation. Nu Yayin challenged Yeowun's conclusion, stating that such a swift decision could not serve as proper proof and warning that he might be throwing away his chance. In the next instant, Yeowun surged forward like a bolt of lightning toward Yayin. Blue blade force chi coated his hand as he struck downward at Yayin's neck with lethal speed. Munku's eyes widened in shock. Nu Yayin, who should have been nothing more than an advisor, calmly remained in place and raised his own hand. Blue blade force chi erupted from his palm as he blocked Yeowun's attack head on. Nu Yayin smiled faintly and remarked that this situation was troublesome, questioning how Yeowun had figured it out. Yeowun revealed that the answer had come through distant whispering. When Nu Yayin questioned what he meant by that, Yeowun explained his reasoning. Yeowun had noticed that the man posing as Hwan Yi would pause briefly before answering after Munku introduced herself. The timing of his responses felt unnatural. At the same moment, Yeowun observed the subtle movement at Munku's neck when she sent a telepathic message. Suspecting something strange, he deliberately changed the subject to prevent the false Hwan Yi from reacting naturally. As expected, that Hwan Yi once again hesitated before responding. Yeowun concluded that if his assumption was wrong, it might still be possible to transmit telepathic messages without visible movement. He immediately ordered Nano to confirm it. With Nano's assistance, he he detected that the true source of the telepathic transmission was clearly coming from the back of the guest house near the entrance. Yeowun explained that ever since Munku greeted Hwan Yi, the one speaking with them had consistently delayed his responses. From that, Yeowun deduced that someone was feeding him information through distant whispering. However, none of the 7 identical men seated at the table showed any vibration in their vocal cords that would indicate message transmission. That meant none of them could be the true sender. The only remaining person in the room capable of sending such messages was Nu Yayin. Nu Yayin then openly acknowledged the discovery. He admitted that he had intentionally allowed the false Hwan Yi to speak in order to confuse Yeowun, only to be caught by his own trap. He formally revealed his true identity as Hwan Yi, the chief of the Flying Phantom sect. Having been impressed by Yeowun's performance in the first test, he declared that they would now proceed directly to the second test. In that instant, Hwan Yi released a surge of power and violently flung Yeowun's arm aside. Yeowun slid backward under the force, struck by the overwhelming strength of the attack. Before he could fully recover, Hwan Yi advanced with blinding speed, his hands leaving behind countless overlapping after images. Yeowun raised his butterfly dance blade to block, but a swift kick pierced through his defense and slammed into his chest. The impact hurled him out of the guest house and into the yard beyond. Yeowun staggered as he landed. The energy that had surged into him through the kick was expelled through his footing, and the ground beneath his foot split apart with a sharp crack. Munku cried out in shock at the violence of the exchange. Hwan Yi remarked lightly that he had no desire to completely destroy the guest house over such a small contest. From the clash, Yeowun immediately recognized the technique that had been used against him. It was the slash of the phantom shadow from the 5th floor of the library, but this version was incomparably more refined. Every weakness he had once studied had been flawlessly covered. Hwan Yi spoke calmly, stating that he had held great expectations after hearing that Yeowun had defeated the chief of the poison sect. Though the old man had been reduced to walking with a cane, he had still been a formidable existence. Hwan Yi added that he had never fought him because there had been no reason to, but now Yeowun would serve as a fitting substitute. He also revealed that he had heard Yeowun had become a saber master after receiving instruction from Submeng. At his words, one of the identical men seated at the table rose and presented a crimson blade to Hwan Yi. As Hwan Yi drew it and settled into a ready stance, he declared that his own signature art was also a saber technique known as the Saber of the Flying Phantom. Yeowun responded by drawing the white dragon blade. As the pale blade emerged into the night air, Hwan Yi's lips curved into a delighted grin. He praised the weapon as remarkable and declared that this would be a worthy battle, urging Yeowun to fight with the same resolve he had shown when he faced Baek-oh. Hwan Yi charged straight at Yeowun, and Yeowun immediately responded by unleashing the second formation of the butterfly dance blade. The white dragon blade whirled in a sharp arc and collided head-on with Hwan Yi's saber. Force chi erupted around both weapons, and the violent clash of metal echoed like thunder throughout the manor, loud enough for Yeowun's companions outside to hear it clearly. The moment the sound reached them, Baek-ji cursed under his breath and sprinted forward without hesitation. The guards tried to stop him, but they were instantly overwhelmed and kicked aside, collapsing unconscious. Samachuk hesitated with a frown, questioning whether they should interfere, but Hobum ignored all doubt and dashed in after Baek-ji, driven by fear for Yeowun's safety. Baek-ji quickly traced the source of the clash to a smaller structure beyond the main courtyard to the right. He surged toward it, but after only a few steps, a man in blue silk suddenly appeared and launched a surprise attack. It was Gung-oh, an outer disciple of the Flying Phantom sect. Hobum, Wang-hul, and Samachuk arrived at Baek-ji's side and formed a defensive line with their backs pressed together. Samachuk immediately drew his sword as he sensed the danger deepening. Dozens of warriors clad in black poured out from the building and surrounded them from all sides, each wearing identical skin masks that made them look like replicas of the same person. Hobum raised the sword of illusion and readied himself, disturbed by the uncanny sight of enemies who all shared the same face. Gung-oh realized that 4 intruders had entered at once and confronted them with hostility, demanding to know who they were and where they came from. Wang-hul stepped forward and revealed his medallion, identifying himself as Wang-hul Ko of the Demon Fist sect, the son of the sect's chief. Gung-oh recognized the name immediately and rebuked him for trespassing into another sect's manor in the dead of night despite belonging to a high-ranking sect. Wang-hul restrained his anger and asserted that they had not come without reason. Their young lord had entered the manor moments months earlier, and they had followed because they believed something dangerous had already begun to unfold. Gung-oh realized with a jolt that the young lord they were speaking of was Cheon Yeowun, the very person their chief had been meeting earlier. At the same moment, the violent sound of clashing blades echoed once again from beyond the courtyard, confirming that a fierce battle was already underway. Wang-hul raised his voice in urgency, declaring that their lord could be in grave danger and that they could not simply stand by and do nothing. He demanded to be allowed to pass and see what was happening. Gung-oh, however, remained unmoved. He asserted that they too served a leader and had no authority to interfere with their chief's affairs. With no other choice left, Wang-hul shifted into a combat stance. Time was running out, and he resolved to force their way through. At that very moment, in the yard before the guest house, Yeowun and Hwan Yi had already exchanged more than 10 intense formations. Hwan Yi closely observed Yeowun's movements and judged that his strength was astonishing for someone only 20 years of age. Even so, he could not reconcile this level of power with the feat of defeating Baek-oh. With a confident grin, he tested whether Yeowun truly believed this was enough to take his jade medallion. Yeowun realized that the butterfly dance technique alone would not allow him to overcome Hwan Yi. With that conclusion, he decided to test a different power. Between the countersword art of the 24 demon swords and the blade skill inherited from the blade god, Yeowun chose the latter. As he abruptly retreated to create distance, Hwan Yi felt genuine surprise. Yeowun's stance changed completely, abandoning the flowing rhythm of the butterfly dance and shifting into something far more violent and oppressive. Confusion flickered across Hwan Yi's perception as he struggled to grasp the nature of the technique being assumed. Yeowun warned inwardly that he might not be able to fully control his strength and resolved to strike without restraint. In the next instant, he charged forward with overwhelming momentum, completely different from his previous attacks. Hwan Yi felt a surge of shock as he sensed the nature of that power and recognized it as the same saber technique Yeowun had used to sever Baek-oh's head. Reacting instantly, Hwan Yi unleashed the final formation of his own blade art to meet the incoming strike. The collision of their blades detonated through the yard in a deafening explosion of metal and force. Yet even as the clash erupted, Hwan Yi's expression darkened. His rapid defensive formations were being broken apart one by Yeowun's blade, which attacked from bizarre, unpredictable angles that defied conventional logics. Hwan Yi struggled to hold his defense, but the overwhelming power embedded in Yeowun's blade shattered his grip, sending his weapon flying from his hand. Yet Yeowun's technique had not ended. The final movement of the formation descended without mercy. A surge of terror seized Hwan Yi. He shut his eyes as the strike fell, and a thunderous explosion roared through the yard. When the sound faded, his body trembled, drenched in cold sweat that washed the makeup from his face. His breath came out in ragged gasps as he slowly opened his eyes. The white dragon blade had carved past him by a hair's breadth. He finally understood with chilling clarity that Yeowun was no ordinary warrior. Outside the guest house, Gung-oh was in the middle of issuing a final warning to Yeowun's companions, urging them to withdraw while they still could. Before he could finish, an enormous wave of energy burst from within the guest house. The air itself grew icy under the pressure. Everyone turned toward the source as the outer wall of the guest house collapsed outward, blue force chi tearing through it and leaving a massive scar that extended all the way beyond the structure. The ground split apart between the two groups. Realizing that disaster had struck inside, Gung-oh and the warriors of the Flying Phantom sect rushed in at once. Yeowun's companions seized the opening and followed immediately behind them. Inside the shattered guest house, both groups froze in shock at the sight before them. Cheon Yeowun stood firmly with the white dragon blade in his hand. Before him, Nu Yayan, now revealed as Hwan Yi, was kneeling on one knee on the ruined ground. Hwan Yi raised his jade medallion with solemn resolve and formally acknowledged Yeowun as worthy of the minor priesthood. With that declaration, he offered the medallion as a symbol of his loyalty and submission. Shock rippled through the warriors who had not known Nu Yayan's true identity. Only now did they comprehend that he had never been a mere advisor. Hobum, regaining his composure, grinned as he looked toward Gung-oh, who stood frozen in disbelief at the sight of his kneeling chief. Relief spread among Yeowun's followers as they confirmed that no harm had come to their lord. After the confrontation was resolved, a new tea table was prepared inside the damaged guest house. Hwan Yi offered a formal bow and apology for the delay. Yeowun observed that Hwan Yi still wore his skin mask and questioned inwardly whether he intended to ever reveal his true face. Hwan Yi explained that for generations, the Flying Phantom sect had belonged to the Dark Order, which was responsible for assassination and espionage. Because of this role, its members were forbidden from revealing their real faces to anyone other than the Patriarch. He stated that only only if Yeowun someday ascended to that position would he be allowed to see Hwan Yi's true appearance. Yeowun then recalled his earlier encounter with Yahwan before leaving the academy. Hwan Yi acknowledged that Yeowun already knew of the connection. Yeowun had attempted to persuade Yahwan to join him, but Yahwan had firmly refused to follow anyone without direct orders from his chief. Through Nano's analysis, Yeowun had immediately recognized that Yahwan also wore a skin mask. Although Yahwan had shown interest, he ultimately declined. Hwan Yi then revealed that he was incapable of having children. This stunned Hobum and Wang Hul. With visible embarrassment, Hwan Yi explained that the Flying Phantom Sect's unique breathing technique, the yin of the ghost, contained an overwhelming concentration of yin energy. To cultivate it safely, members were required to undergo castration at a young age. A wave of discomfort passed over Hobum and Wang Hul as they instinctively glanced downward. Hwan Yi continued that, despite this, the sect still needed to preserve its lineage. For that reason, they adopted children to carry on their will. As for his bond with Hwan Ya, Hwan Yi clarified that it was closer to that of master and disciple rather than that of parent and child. Hwan Yi issued a firm warning that everything heard that day was to be forgotten. The command carried such authority that even Hobum grew tense and nodded in silent agreement. Hwan Yi then relaxed and turned his gaze toward Wang Hul with a teasing air, singling him out as an exception. The gesture only made Wang Hul stiffen further, and he silently resolved to remain quiet as well. As they continued drinking tea, Hwan Yi's curiosity shifted toward Munku. He subtly pressed her about the matter she had been hiding now that she had left the academy. Munku froze for a moment, then hurriedly stated that she would only address it once her grandfather returned, and she went back to the demonic dragon clan. She cut him off before he could say anything further. Among everyone present, only Yeowun was aware of her true secret. Hwan Yi laughed lightly and accepted her answer. Once the tea gathering concluded, Yeowun and his companions prepared to leave for their next destination. Hwan Yi expressed regret that he had been unable to offer proper hospitality that night, and offered them the use of the Flying Phantom Sect's guest house if they wished to stay. Yeowun immediately recognized that this was a gesture of consideration, knowing he currently had no place to rest. He bowed in gratitude and asked for permission to bring one additional person with him. Hwan Yi readily agreed and offered to have his men retrieve the person on Yeowun's behalf. Yeowun declined the offer of assistance, stating that he would go himself, and thanked him once more for the courtesy. Yeowun had intended to return to his old home immediately after leaving the academy to meet Guard Zhang, but circumstances had first led him elsewhere. Now, at last, he moved toward the southern side of the demonic cult where his childhood home stood. He had expected that many things would have changed with time, yet the small house remained clean and well kept. Guard Zhang had always risen early to practice and would meticulously sweep the yard afterward. Yeowun had lived in this modest home with him until the age of 15. To Yeowun, Guard Zhang had been no different from a parent. With anticipation rising in his chest after so long apart, Yeowun opened the gate and stepped inside, while Munku and the others followed with curious eyes. The moment Yeowun entered the yard, the excitement vanished from his face. He stood frozen with a dark expression. His gaze trembled as it fixed on Guard Zhang's room, and his senses told him that no presence lingered inside. Yeowun hurried to the door and opened it, only to find the room completely empty. All of Guard Zhang's belongings were still in place, making it impossible that he had simply left in the middle of the night. The room carried no trace of warmth. From the cold stillness within, Yeowun judged that it had been abandoned for at least 3 or 4 days. While the others searched the surrounding area, Wang Hul confirmed that nothing unusual could be found anywhere on the premises. Yeowun clenched his teeth. Guard Zhang had been an orphan with no surviving family and nowhere to visit. The courtyard had been swept clean, which would not have seemed strange if Guard Zhang were still here, but under these circumstances, it only deepened the unease. There were no signs of a struggle, no disturbance that could point to what had happened. If Guard Zhang had been taken, the one responsible had erased every trace with terrifying precision. Yeowun realized that nothing could be uncovered with his natural senses alone. He immediately ordered Nano to scan the entire property for any sign of intrusion or combat. As Nano activated, a layer of white light swept across Yeowun's vision, scanning every inch of the house and surrounding grounds. In the midst of the examination, a single marked point appeared within his field of view, fixed above one of the pillars directly over the cornerstone of the house. Yeowun focused on the marked point and identified them as faint traces left by sword energy rather than by a physical blade. Even so, they were too vague to determine anything with certainty. Without evidence tied to a specific codified fighting form, there was still no solid lead. At that moment, Wang Hul felt a sudden oppressive pressure and flinched. When he looked at Yeowun, he saw that Yeowun's eyes had darkened with barely restrained hostility. Wang Hul realized that he had never seen his lord suppress his emotions so intensely. It felt as though a volcano were on the verge of erupting. Considering that Guard Zhang had been like a father to Yeowun, the reaction was natural. Samachuk reasoned that if sword energy had been used, the list of suspects narrowed. Among the 6 main sects, the ones that primarily relied on sword techniques were the Sword Sect, the Shadow Sect, and the Musician Sect. Yeowun weighed the possibilities. All 3 were plausible culprits. The Shadow Sect was already entangled in conflicts with the other 4 sects, which might suggest they lacked the time for such an operation. Yet the crime itself was too precise and meticulous. The culprit could easily have exploited the current chaos as a distraction. No faction could be safely ruled out. Hobum proposed investigating every sect that raised suspicion, especially since many elders were currently absent, which could make infiltration easier. Chuck immediately countered that such a plan would not be simple. Even without their chiefs, the 6 main sects still held overwhelming power. The Flying Phantom sect was proof enough. Despite not being one of the main sects, the moment intrusion was detected, a swarm of first-rate masters had mobilized. Even if they managed to break in unnoticed, searching an entire manor would be nearly impossible. Wang Hul then stressed that whoever had taken Guard Zhang was clearly targeting Yeowun himself. Guard Zhang had only been a means to that end. Once the enemy learned that Yeowun had left the academy, they would undoubtedly make their next move. Before any concrete plan could be finalized, the day slipped into night. In a damp, foul-smelling place shrouded in darkness, a single candle flickered weakly. The room was enclosed by iron bars that could only be opened from the outside. The stench of blood saturated the air. Against the wall inside the cell, a man was bound by chains through both arms and suspended in place. His body was bare, covered in wounds torn open by relentless torture, and fresh blood continued to trail down his skin. The middle-aged torturer pressed a red-hot metal stamp against the man's chest. A piercing scream tore through the cell as the victim jolted awake in agony. It was Zhang Gageng. The torturer coldly warned that he was not permitted to sleep until every question was answered. Without hesitation, the heated metal was driven into Guard Zhang's abdomen again, drawing another scream that echoed off the iron bars. A woman's voice drifted in from outside the cell, remarking on his surprising endurance for a mere guard. It was Lady Mu. She stepped closer and stated that she was busy, then asked one final question, whether the patriarch had ever taught the boy martial arts. Guard Zhang, barely conscious, denied it with what little strength remained. Lady Mu scoffed at his persistence even at death's edge and ordered the torture to continue. As the torturer moved to comply, a long-bearded middle-aged man suddenly rushed into the cell. He bowed hurriedly before Lady Mu and reported that Cheon Yeowun had left the academy. Lady Mu laughed softly at the news, remarking that Yeowun's timing was most unfortunate. She asked where he was now. The bearded man leaned in and whispered the location into her ear. At those words, Lady Mu's expression shifted with interest. Bound to the wall, Guard Zhang was seized by despair as he overheard the news of Yeowun's whereabouts. In his broken state, he silently prayed for Yeowun's safety. An hour later, at the largest restaurant on Waho Street, 3 figures sat at a table on the first floor, quietly eating. Hobum voiced his doubt about whether their plan would truly succeed. Munku admitted she was uncertain, but if Wang Hul's prediction proved correct, contact was inevitable. She reflected that choosing a crowded place made secret attacks difficult, yet using Yeowun as bait while the others investigated the remaining sects was an extremely bold move. The question remained whether their enemy would truly make a move against him. At that moment, a telepathic message entered Yeowun's mind, warning him to remain completely still and to show no reaction to his companions. Any sign of awareness would result in consequences he would regret. The message implied that the sender could see his every action and was somewhere inside the restaurant. Yeowun obeyed without hesitation, continuing to eat as though nothing had changed. At the same time, he silently ordered Nano to locate the origin of the telepathic transmission. Nano immediately acknowledged the command and began scanning the frequency of the energy wave, shifting Yeowun's auditory perception to a different range. A faint, distorted whistling sound filled his ears, and the telepathic voice transmitted its message once more with crystal clarity. The sender demanded that Yeowun come to the Poison Sect Manor by 1 in the morning, unarmed. The threat was precise and absolute. If Yeowun brought the saber on his back, his arm would be severed before he even crossed the gate. The message continued with further conditions. He must come alone, ahead of schedule, and no one was to be detected within 300 feet of the manor. If even a shadow appeared nearby, the hostage would be killed instantly. The sender made it clear that there would be no second chances and no room for tricks. With that final warning, the presence vanished from the entrance of the restaurant. Yeowun remained perfectly still, masking his reaction, but his senses locked onto the direction from which the transmission had originated. The sound had come from the entrance, yet the man's face had been obscured by the crowd. The instant the presence retreated, Yeowun rose from his seat. At that same moment, 4 men stationed at different tables stood up and fixed hostile gazes on him. Without hesitation, Yeowun moved. In a flash, he appeared before each of them and struck with precise, controlled blows. 3 of the men collapsed instantly, unconscious before they even realized what had happened. The 4th, a middle-aged man, was seized by the throat and lifted into the air by Yeowun's grip. A suffocating, killing intent surged from Yeowun's body, crushing down on the man's spirit with terrifying pressure. The man, nothing more than a third-rate warrior, completely broke under the weight of that aura. His body trembled violently, fear overwhelmed him, and he lost consciousness after losing all control of himself. Munku and Hobom rushed over in alarm. Yeowun stared at the unconscious man in frustration and realized that these were not the agents he was looking for. He selected 2 of the fallen men and handed one of them over to Hobom, instructing him to take the one who had soiled himself. They were brought to a secure location near the southern gate of the castle. After the men were revived and interrogated, the truth surfaced exactly as Yeowun had expected. They had merely been paid to observe and report his movements. They knew nothing of the real mastermind behind the scheme and begged desperately for their lives. After assessing their fear and responses, it became clear that they were not lying. Hobom confirmed that the captives were not lying, and Munku verified through their identification badges that they were nothing more than ordinary martial artists. Yeowun decided to spare their lives, but he refused to release them. With precise strikes to the back of their heads, he sealed their blood points and rendered them completely immobile. He then ordered them to be bound and locked inside the storage room. Hobom immediately carried out the command. Yeowun determined that he would have to wait for the rest of his group to return before gathering any further clues. The 3 he had dispatched earlier were scheduled to return by 6 in the evening. The first to come back was Wang Hul, who had been sent to observe the musician sect. Wang Hul reported that there had been visitors at the musician sect, but no activity that appeared suspicious or unusual. Yeowun questioned whether he had seen anyone wearing a large straw hat, but Wang Hul confirmed that he had not. This narrowed the suspects further. With no signs pointing toward the musician sect, the remaining likely culprits were the Shadow sect and the Sword sect. Yeowun decided that no conclusions could be drawn until Baekji and Chuck returned with their reports. However, as time passed, both of them were now more than an hour late. Wang Hul expressed unease at their delay, sensing that something was wrong. The sun was already sinking toward the horizon, and Yeowun realized with a grim certainty that trouble had occurred. At the same time, to the north of the castle at the mansion of the Shadow sect, Lady Mu sat calmly in the living room, gazing at the crimson sky as she drank her tea. Warriors of the Shadow sect soon entered the courtyard in disciplined formation. Behind them, 2 unconscious young men were being carried. The warriors laid both figures on the ground before Lady Mu. An old man smiled as he addressed her, reporting that one of them had been discovered hiding near the Sword sect's mansion, and that he had offered considerable resistance. The old man's gaze settled on the young man lying motionless on the ground. It was Baekji. The bearded man reported that Baekji was not even 20 years old, yet had already stepped into the realm of a transcendent master, admitting with humiliation that they would not have been able to subdue him without the assistance of the outer disciple warriors. Lady Mu accepted the result without reproach, satisfied as long as their task had been completed. She imagined Yeowun's confusion as he struggled to determine which sect had abducted his precious guard, and the thought pleased her. As she displayed satisfaction, the bearded man reflected inwardly that even after serving her for nearly 20 years, she still instilled fear in him. The moment she learned that Yeowun had left the academy, she had instantly realized that he was attempting to draw her into a trap. He believed that had she not chosen to become the patriarch's woman, she could have risen to become the next chief of the Shadow sect herself. Lady Mu then inquired about the identities of the 2 young men. The old man reported that one of them was Baekji of the Pure Kick sect. Lady Mu recognized it as a high-ranking sect and was astonished that Yeowun had managed to make such a figure his follower, concluding that Yeowun must have fought relentlessly within the academy to earn such loyalty. She then questioned the identity of the second captive. The old man explained that this one was the son of the 9th elder and belonged to the warrior dance sect. At the mention of the warrior dance sect, Lady Mu stiffened. She realized that this meant the boy was Sama Yi's son. In her thoughts, she acknowledged that Yeowun had even secured the support of the warrior dance sect and that his talent for surrounding himself with powerful allies made him extraordinarily dangerous. With the patriarch absent, she judged that this was the perfect opportunity to eliminate him. If he were not killed now, he would become far too difficult to deal with in the future. She resolved to end his life and lure him fully into the serpent's maw. Moments later, at approximately approximately 1 in the morning, in the western corner within the demonic cult's city walls near the manor of the Poison Sect, warriors of the Shadow Sect were concealed on every building within a 300-foot radius of the mansion, monitoring every movement in the area. At that time, a single figure was seen approaching the Poison Sect manor. It was Cheon Yeowun. He carried neither blade nor sword, leaving behind the weapons he usually bore. The Shadow Sect had already been lying in wait for nearly an hour when Yeowun arrived. Lady Mu observed his appearance with visible satisfaction, confident that he had walked straight into the trap she had prepared. Yeowun, however, immediately sensed the scale of the ambush. Even with a brief sweep of his perception, he could feel the presence of at least 200 hidden warriors surrounding the area. Such meticulous preparation left no doubt that they intended to end everything here. Lady Mu regarded him with a smile and gestured for him to come closer. Yeowun's thoughts churned as he faced her at last. Before his mother had passed away, Lady Mu had come to their home with the other women and forced him to swear that he would not cultivate his internal energy before entering the academy. The woman standing before him now was the same Lady Mu of the Shadow Sect. The realization sharpened his hostility. Lady Mu remarked on how much time had passed and how grown he had become, cruelly likening him to his mother while mocking both of them for making her life difficult. She scorned him for falling into such an obvious trap, claiming that his emotional weakness proved he was not destined for greatness. Yeowun demanded to know the whereabouts of Guard-jang and his followers. Lady Mu openly admitted that she had gone to great lengths to capture her hostages and had no intention of releasing them so easily. Her repeated insistence only deepened the cold fury in Yeowun's eyes. Provoked by his glare, Lady Mu contemptuously suggested that his internal energy should be sealed first before anything else was done. At her signal, the long-bearded man stepped forward and approached Yeowun, warning him not to resist if he wished to keep Guard-jang alive. Yeowun instantly recognized him as the one who had delivered the telepathic threat at the inn. The man lunged to strike, intending to suppress Yeowun's energy, but before his hand could reach Yeowun's abdomen, Yeowun seized his wrist with lightning speed. With a single crushing twist, bone shattered in the opposite direction, bursting through flesh as the man's arm was grotesquely snapped apart. Lady Mu reacted with sudden fury, declaring that if Yeowun truly cared so little for his guard's life, she could end it with a single gesture. Before she could finish the threat, Yeowun calmly tossed a small wooden box onto the table between them. The unexpected object drew her suspicion as she questioned what it was. At his wordless prompting, she hesitated, then lifted the lid. The moment she saw what lay inside, her eyes shook violently. A freshly torn human eyeball rested within the box, blood still dripping from it. Shock froze her expression as Yeowun quietly urged her to consider whose eye it might be. A wave of dread surged through her as a horrifying thought flashed across her mind. If this truly belonged to her son, she immediately rejected the idea, forcing herself to deny it. She accused Yeowun of attempting a crude deception and claimed that if he had truly infiltrated the academy to do such a thing, the deputy would never have let him go. She dismissed the evidence as a pitiful trick meant to fool her. Yeowun did not answer. Instead, he responded with a faint, wordless smile. 4 hours earlier, within a secluded prison cave at the northeast edge of the demonic academy, 2 cadets awaited their expulsion in confinement, Chun Muyeon and Jin-yun Mu of the Shadow Sect. When the stone entrance opened and Yeowun appeared before them, Muyeon was struck with disbelief. He could not comprehend how Yeowun had reached this place. Yeowun stood over him with glacial authority and commanded him to kneel. The surge of Yeowun's internal energy erupted outward, crushing Muyeon to the ground on his knees. Even without his energy being sealed, Muyeon realized he would never have been able to withstand that overwhelming pressure. Yeowun revealed that Guard-jang had gone missing. Muyeon showed no recognition of the name. Yeowun then stated that the kidnappers had demanded he walk unarmed into their trap if he wished to save his guard. Muyeon realized without doubt that his mother was the one who had orchestrated everything. He demanded to know what Yeowun expected him to do about it. Yeowun responded with a cold flick of his hand, and Muyeon's 2 arms were violently wrenched upward by an unseen force. Panic seized him as he struggled to understand what was happening. He had no knowledge of who Guard-jang was, but Yeowun ignored his confusion entirely. Yeowun stated that he had originally intended to save Guard-jang and end the matter there, but after uncovering the true mastermind behind it all, his intentions had changed. He questioned how valuable Muyeon truly was to the Shadow Sect, and more importantly, to his own mother. Muyeon trembled in fear and warned that harming him would only worsen the situation for guard Jang. Before he could finish, Yeowun's sword chi shot through Muyeon's wrists. Both hands were severed in an instant and fell to the ground. Muyeon's eyes widened in shock as an agonizing scream tore from his throat. He collapsed to his knees, writhing in pain, and condemned Yeowun as a monster. Yeowun acknowledged the accusation and stated that this alone was not enough. Merely showing his severed hands would not be sufficient to instill true terror in his mother at the thought of losing her precious son. Muyeon, overwhelmed by pain and dread, demanded to know what Yeowun intended to do. In the next instant, Yeowun's hand pierced into Muyeon's right eye. A scream of unbearable agony echoed through the prison as Yeowun tore the eye out without hesitation. Time returned to 4 hours later. Lady Mu's eyes shook violently as realization struck her, as though an earthquake had seized her vision. Yeowun stated that there was one final thing he had yet to present. He placed another object onto the table. It was a medal bearing the unmistakable mark of the Shadow Sect. Lady Mu recognized it instantly. It was the very medal she had once given to her son, and the realization struck her that the eye inside the box truly belonged to Muyeon. The truth that Yeowun had gone this far shattered her composure. She demanded to know what Yeowun wanted. Yeowun made his demand clear. He required the immediate release of his followers and guard Jung. Lady Mu steadied her emotions and resolved to feign cooperation in order to reclaim her son. She agreed to the exchange, making it clear that she expected Muyeon's return in exchange for the captives. Yeowun acknowledged this condition. She issued an order for his people to be freed at once. Two warriors swiftly departed from the mansion to carry it out. Lady Mu then turned her attention back to Yeowun and pressed him for Muyeon's location, preparing to dispatch one of her men in his place if necessary. Yeowun revealed that his followers were currently holding both Muyeon and Jinyun Mu inside the academy's detention center. Lady Mu inwardly believed that Yeowun had fallen for her deception far too easily. Convinced that she had regained the upper hand, she prepared to overturn the situation completely. Yeowun then threw the Shadow Sect badge toward her and warned that once his followers were shown the proof, they would bring Muyeon and Jinyun out. He made it clear that none of the hostages would be released until the exchange was fully completed, and he warned her not to attempt any deceit. Lady Mu handed the medal to the old warrior at her side and instructed him to proceed. At the same time, she transmitted a secret telepathic command, ordering him to slaughter every one of Yeowun's followers after retrieving her son. The old warrior accepted the task without hesitation, took the medal, and vanished from the mansion. At his signal, the hidden warriors stationed across the surrounding buildings also began to move. With every order placed, Lady Mu turned toward Yeowun with a satisfied expression. In her mind, she remained confident that Uncle Seon, an ultimate transcendent master, would have no difficulty slaughtering Yeowun's followers. None of them possessed strength comparable to an elder, and once her son and Jinyun were safely returned, she intended to ensure Yeowun's death would be slow and miserable. Seon soon arrived at the demonic academy with 10 warriors, suppressing their energy as much as possible as they infiltrated the grounds. He had prepared himself for heavy resistance, yet the lack of proper guards at both the gate and within the academy itself made him scoff. The security was far worse than he expected, and he realized that Yeowun could have been eliminated with ease if they had acted earlier. When Seon reached the hill where the prison cave was located, he ordered his warriors to hide below and prepare an ambush for Yeowun's followers once they descended. He alone moved to the peak and expanded his senses to locate Muyeon and Jinyun. He detected a presence and advanced, only to freeze in shock when he saw that the stone sealing the cave had already been opened. As he stepped inside, 3 instructors of the demonic academy emerged with drawn swords. Ho Jin-chang immediately denounced Seon for daring to infiltrate the academy and demanded his surrender. Realizing he had fallen into a trap, Seon turned at once and fled down the mountain in panic, cursing the deception and forcing himself to escape at all costs. However, when he reached the slope below, his escape came to an abrupt halt. The warriors he had ordered to lie in ambush were sprawled across the ground, drenched in blood. Standing calmly before their bodies was a man with long, blazing red hair, Left Guardian Lee Ha-ming. Seon barely had time to react before Ha-ming's crimson sword pierced straight through his neck. Terror flashed through Seon's eyes as life faded from him, and that was the final sight he ever witnessed. Back at the Poison Sect Manor, Lady Mu maintained the facade of composure as she drank her tea, yet her unease grew with every passing moment. Yeowun calmly observed her restlessness and inwardly discerned the truth of her anxiety. When he revealed his awareness that she had sent a super master to slaughter his followers, the realization struck her like thunder. She finally understood that she had been deceived. Shock overtook her as she attempted to issue new orders to the Shadow Sect warriors. Before she could finish, chaos erupted across the rooftops as archers cried out in alarm. A lone intruder moved with terrifying speed, evading every arrow as he descended into the courtyard. courtyard. Lady Mu's composure shattered when she recognized the figure who had landed before her. It was Fire King Lee Ha-meng. Only then did she notice what he carried in his right hand. The severed head of her Uncle San hung from his grip, blood still fresh. Yeowun acknowledged Lee Ha-meng's arrival with firm approval, and Ha-meng responded with a respectful bow, confirming the task had been completed without issue. Lady Mu bit down on her lips, shock surging through her as a dreadful realization formed within her. The possibility that even the left guardian might now stand on Yeowun's side filled her with disbelief and rage. Unable to restrain herself, she lashed out, accusing Ha-meng of violating the laws of the cult by lending his support to a candidate of the minor priesthood. Ha-meng calmly corrected her, stating that the tournament of the minor priesthood had already concluded. His words struck her like a blow, and her expression twisted in alarm as she began to understand the implication. Yeowun observed her faltering hope and stated that she must have believed eliminating him would reopen the path for the remaining candidates. Lady Mu stiffened as she realized her expectations had been thoroughly dismantled. She warned Yeowun not to provoke her further, her confidence relying on the forces she still commanded within the manor. Yet she was fully aware that with Ha-meng now standing beside him, direct confrontation was no longer an option. She decided that delaying until the elders of the six clans returned was her only viable course of action. She attempted to regain control by threatening Guard Zhang's life, but her words were abruptly cut off when one of her warriors leapt onto the roof to survey the surroundings. The man froze in shock and urgently reported the presence of overwhelming movement outside. As Lady Mu released her senses, her face darkened. Numerous presences were now closing in around the mansion from all directions. Confusion and fear surged through her as she tried to comprehend the sudden turn of events. At that moment, a figure descended into the courtyard from above the rooftops. It was the 11th Elder, Huan Yi. He declared that he had arrived in time. Lady Mu did not recognize him, as Huan Yi rarely revealed himself outside of formal gatherings with the Patriarch or the Elders. Huan Yi then formally bowed toward Yeowun and declared that he had completed the task entrusted to him by the young lord. Yeowun expressed his acknowledgement of Huan Yi's efforts, inquiring about the condition of those who had been rescued. Dread surged through Lady Mu as she grasped the meaning of their exchange. In that instant, she realized that the strange individual before her was truly the 11th Elder, and her unease deepened into fear. Huan Yi reported that Yeowun's followers had only suffered minor internal injuries, but Guard Zhang's condition was critical. A physician had already been summoned to tend to him, yet there was no certainty that he would survive much longer. The moment Yeowun learned of Guard Zhang's condition, a terrifying hostility erupted from his body. The restrained fury within him finally burst forth. The overwhelming pressure crushed down on everyone present, causing the warriors of the Shadow Sect to tremble as if their hearts were being strangled by his mere presence. The aura of an end-stage supreme-level warrior was far beyond what they could endure. Lady Mu seethed inwardly in frustration. She had never imagined that Yeowun would even draw the Flying Phantom sect into his ranks. The reality before her far exceeded all of her expectations, yet she refused to accept loss easily, clinging to the ambition she had nurtured for so long to elevate the Shadow Sect above all others. At that moment, Munku stepped forward with Wang Hul and Hobom, bringing the final hostages with them. The Shadow Sect warriors were forced to allow them through to prevent further harm. Lady Mu's face drained of all color when she saw Cheon Yeowun. His condition was horrific. Both of his severed hands were wrapped in blood-stained cloth, and one of his eyes had been torn out and covered. Jin Yun-mu was also brought forward, restrained tightly. Seeing her son in such a wretched state shattered what remained of Lady Mu's composure. Tears streamed down her face as rage and despair twisted together inside her. After struggling to steady her breathing, she finally collapsed to her knees before Yeowun. In desperation, she struck her head against the ground and openly conceded defeat. She acknowledged Yeowun as the rightful minor priest and begged for mercy for her children and the warriors of the Shadow Sect. Lady Mu transmitted a desperate command through telepathy, forcing Muyun into silence. She ordered him to endure the humiliation and focus only on survival, declaring that she would bow before Yeowun as many times as needed if it meant preserving her son's life. She openly pledged that the Shadow Sect would never harm Yeowun and begged for his mercy with her head pressed to the ground. Yeowun looked down at her without emotion, then turned toward Muyun and Jin-yun. He instructed Wang Hul and Hobom to release them and move back. As the two were freed, Lee Ha-meng observed in silence, sensing that Lady Mu would never truly accept such humiliation without resentment. For a brief moment, Lady Mu believed she had escaped with her son's life, but Yeowun turned back to her with icy calm and made it clear that a simple bow could never erase what she had done. He declared that she would experience the same suffering she had inflicted upon others. In an instant, instant, white blade chi burst from Yeowun's hand. His movements were merciless and impossibly fast. In a single flash, the limbs of both Moyeon and Jinyun were severed. Their bodies collapsed to the ground as blood poured from the stumps, and their screams of agony tore through the courtyard. Lady Mu's eyes turned bloodshot as madness overwhelmed her. Before she could fully register what was happening, Yeowun's blade chi struck again. Muyeon's head was cleanly severed and rolled across the ground. Lady Mu lunged forward in horror, her breathing breaking apart as she reached out toward her son's fallen head. Silence fell over the courtyard. Everyone stood frozen, overwhelmed by the grotesque display of ruthless violence that had unfolded before their eyes. Lady Mu's hands trembled as she finally clutched her son's severed head. Her breath came in broken gasps as shock and grief tore through her. Yeowun coldly told her that the pain she felt now was the same agony he had once endured, and that it was finally her turn to suffer. The moment crossed the line of what the Shadow Sect warriors could endure. They drew their weapons in unison, their killing intent surging forward. In response, Lee Ha-meng drew out his flame sword and poured blue force chi into it, carving a blazing line across the ground between the two sides. He declared that anyone who crossed that line would die without exception, daring them to gamble their lives. One reckless warrior ignored the warning and charged at Yeowun with a furious roar, intent on killing him. He was cut in half before he reached even a few steps forward. A scream tore from his throat as his body collapsed, his spine and waist cleanly severed by Hwan Yi. Amid the chaos, Lady Mu remained kneeling, lost in her shattered mind as she clutched her son's head. She muttered brokenly, unable to comprehend where everything had gone wrong. Tears mixed with her son's blood as they streamed down her face. Her teeth clenched as she demanded to know why Yeowun had taken her son's life when she claimed the trap had been her doing alone. Yeowun condemned her shamelessness to the very end and revealed the truth she had tried to bury. He stated that she was the one who had killed his mother and that she still dared to beg him for mercy. Lady Mu froze in disbelief, her eyes widening in shock as she stared at him. Yeowun then pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and threw it before her. Her hands shook as she read the words written upon it. The message named Cheon Jong-sum of the Poison Clan and declared that he had something important to tell Cheon Yeowun. 10 hours earlier, just after noon at the Poison Clan's mansion, a pale and emaciated young man lay barely moving on a bed within the main room. It was Cheon Jong-sum. Baek Seng had entered and announced his presence, and Jong-sum slowly acknowledged him despite his fading strength. Jong-sum weakly questioned Baek Seng about whether the Shadow Sect had made any moves. Baek Seng reported that according to their observers watching the Shadow Sect, one of Cheon Yeowun's followers had been taken by them. The moment Jong-sum realized the Shadow Sect was involved, his eyes trembled with realization. He knew Yeowun cherished his followers like family, and the Shadow Sect's interference created a perfect opportunity. With the Poison Sect having lost most of its manpower after the failed ambush, and the Shadow Sect likely preparing to erase the remnants, Jong-sum decided that Yeowun and Lady Mu needed to clash directly so that at least one of them would die. With a sly intent, Jong-sum summoned his inner disciple and ordered him to record every word he was about to say. He dictated everything he knew about the truth behind Lady Hwa's death, and had the letter sent to Cheon Yeowun immediately. Now, as Lady Mu read that same letter, realization struck her with crushing force. She understood that this was how Yeowun had uncovered who abducted his followers, and how he learned the truth of his mother's death. Not even the patriarch knew this secret, yet Jong-sum, who should have been bedridden, had still managed to expose her. At last, Lady Mu admitted her crime outright. Her face twisted in uncontrollable rage as she glared at Yeowun. She openly confessed that she had killed his mother and threatened him with the authority of her brother, the first elder, declaring that she would destroy his followers if he dared lay a hand on her. In response, Blue Force Chi tore through her eyes in an instant. Lady Mu screamed as her vision was destroyed and blood poured from the deep slashes. Yeowun's Force Chi then carved through her mouth, erasing her ability to speak. Her teeth and tongue were destroyed as her face collapsed into a grotesque ruin, and she crumpled to the ground in silent agony. The warriors of the Shadow Sect finally cried out in outrage, warning that he would face dire consequences once the First Elder learned of this, and declaring that the full might of the Shadow Sect had yet to be revealed. Yeowun stated that the First Elder would never hear of this. At his motion, force energy surged toward a distant storage building. The door burst open under the pull of his power, and corpses piled inside spilled out onto the ground. A thick stench of blood flooded the area. Among the dead lay Baek Seng, the last leader of the Poison Clan, and Cheon Jong-sum, whose eyes remained open in death from the suffering he had endured. Yeowun declared that the First Elder would never learn the truth because both the Shadow Sect and the Poison Clan would be annihilated in that place. The warriors of the Shadow Sect averted their gazes at the sight of the bodies, but Yeowun's rage did not subside. He issued the order for total extermination. At that command, Left Guardian Lee Ha-meng and 11th Elder Hwan Yi launched themselves into the Shadow Sect warriors. Supreme level power tore through the courtyard. Blades and sword energy swept across the battlefield as screams erupted in succession. It was not a battle, but a complete slaughter. The Shadow Sect warriors fell one after another, unable to withstand the overwhelming strength before them. Lady Mu, blinded and mutilated, could only hear the screams of her clansmen as they were cut down. She writhed on the ground in helpless fury as the sounds of death echoed around her. Yeowun stepped forward and pressed his boot down upon her head, declaring that once the screams ended, her own death would follow. The Shadow Sect warriors resisted in desperation, but their struggle was futile. Some attempted to flee, only to be intercepted and slain by the Flying Phantom Sect warriors who encircled the mansion. One by one, the cries of the Shadow Sect were silenced. With each scream that faded, Lady Mu's terror deepened. She was driven by a twisted agony, wishing for the screams to end, while simultaneously fearing their silence. As the final voices were extinguished, only the aftermath of the massacre remained, and the certainty of her approaching execution closed in. After a long while, every trace of screaming and movement vanished from the Poison Clan's mansion, and an unnatural silence settled over the blood-soaked grounds. The massacre was complete. Lee Ha-meng confirmed that all resistance had been eradicated, and Yeowun turned his gaze toward Hwan Yi. Yeowun instructed Hwan Yi to have the Flying Phantom Sect scour the Poison Sect's apothecary for any usable poisons and then apply those substances to the corpses of the Shadow Sect. Hwan Yi accepted the order without hesitation and departed to mobilize his men. Yeowun then turned back to Lady Mu, who was still collapsed on the ground. Her body shuddered violently as she realized that nothing remained to protect her. His voice carried no emotion as he declared that it was now her turn. He commanded her to repent to his mother until her very existence faded into dust. A thin line of sharp chi pierced straight through the right side of her neck. Her body convulsed once, and then all movement ceased as she fell into lifeless darkness. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.